Well, first, thank you, Judge Carter. I appreciate you holding this tonight and your flexibility and allowing me some time to share, as we've talked about before in times on the floor, various aspects of the growth of the regulatory state. And the issue is not being against regulation or for regulation. The issue is having transparency and accountability. We've seen in this administration, in the last administration, the administration before that, an ever-increasing reach in agencies where they're stretching the law, whether it's the Clean Air Act of 1972 that's being stretched to proportions far beyond the original intent of Congress, or issues related to the Clean Water Act that stretch beyond the bounds of science, to unfunded mandates and No Child Left Behind from the last administration. We can think of a wide variety of these issues. And for me, I think the American public wakes up when it hits them in the pocketbook, when it hits you and me in the pocketbook. In our case, you probably experienced the same thing in Texas. The year that I was sworn into Congress, a consent decree was forced upon our local community for nearly $1 billion in stormwater compliance that was not only beyond the needs of the community, it was beyond the economic capability of the community to comply. That was based on a rule issued by an interpretation of a law that had been passed 8 years before in a different Congress, in a different political climate. And again, our citizens, the citizens of the 4th District of Kentucky, citizens of districts across the United States had no recourse but to comply with this. And one of my constituents walked in as we wrestled with different aspects of not limiting regulation, but providing accountability, providing the opportunity for the voters, our citizens, to be able to hold the government accountable for what it does, walked in and said to me, "Geoff, why can't you guys vote on this?" And we had a revelation in a different way to come back and address the issue of regulatory transparency. Standardization is important, but it needs to be at a place that the American people agree with and support and is practicable from the standpoint of cost. And the economic cost is often not incurred in this. We have towns across the United States, across the Ohio Valley, whose compliance cost with just that regulation alone is more than what the budgets of the communities are on an annual basis. It's unreasonable, and there's no recourse. So we went back and we researched and found a portion in the Congressional Review Act of 1995 that we suggested changing. And only one, to the shock of many of my constituents, only one regulation has ever been repealed in the history of the Congress. That was the Clinton-era ergonomics rule that had the House, the Senate, and a president who would sign that. So you have to get, in effect, a majority in the House, a supermajority in the Senate, and then have a chief executive who's willing to change that or to prevent that regulation from going into effect. What we wanted to do was something a little bit different. It's done in industry, it's done in business, in effect it's done in virtually all competitive sports. If something gets out of bounds or out of expectation, the game stops. In production, the assembly line, the red light comes on, the line stops, and people have to take an extra look at what the issue is. And in this case, what we wanted to do was have a simple process to restore transparency and congressional accountability of what the executive branch does. And that was the genesis of the REINS Act. And it's really a very simple thing. The REINS Act stands for the Regulations of the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. It's House Resolution 10. In this Congress, the number on the chart up there was from the last Congress, H.R. 3765. And basically what it does, it requires Congress to approve all new major rules. The major rule is defined as one that has $100 million or more in cumulative economic impact across our country. What our bill will do is really very simple. Once a rule comes to the end of the 60-day comment period, it would have to come back up to Capitol Hill for a standalone up or down vote under a joint resolution in the House, in the Senate, and then be signed by the President of the United States. And it's making the point that for any major rule, a rule that reaches into the pocketbook of all hard-working, tax-paying Americans, they have a right to be able to hold their elected representatives and senators accountable for the position that they take on that direct economic impact. And for me, I think it's fine. There are times that America will stand up and say, yes, we agree with this, this is the right thing to do. There are other times, particularly in hard economic times like today, the last thing that we want to do is increase that regulatory burden, that out-of-pocket cost on America's citizens. To give an idea of this, the cost in 2009 alone of regulation on our economy for compliance was $1.75 trillion. If that was taken away some significant portion of that, where the regulatory process was streamlined, that would be creating jobs and more taxpayers ultimately.
If the gentleman would yield back for just a moment, let me point out that that 1.75 trillion is more than the entire income tax for that year that was collected by this country. So when you talk about a burden, it's more than the entire tax burden of our nation.
I think the gentleman has a great point. In fact, it comes down, I think, to about $10,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States of America is the cost of regulatory compliance.
Yield back. Go ahead.
And why it's so critical now, to your point, we've seen agencies in the last administration and this administration who have gone into overreach. But most importantly, what we've seen happen in the last Congress, where there was a Democratic supermajority in the House, in the Senate, with a liberal Democratic president who was out to keep his campaign promises. And I can respect that. The American people spoke in that election, but they also spoke in the election that followed last year that they did not agree with the overreach, be it legislative or on the regulatory side, and made a change, certainly in this body. The administration proceeded at that point to attempt to enact cap and trade rules, an energy tax on every American by regulation when the Congress in a Democratic supermajority could not pass those bills to send them to the president's desk. They were intent on doing it by executive order. The same thing that we see happening potentially with the card check, forced unionization bill, could not pass in the last Congress. We see attempts to move that by regulation. There are issues with unfunded mandates on our schools, and even seeing an extension of that inside the Department of Education that further hamstrings already strapped local school districts. That could not get through the United States Congress. We're seeing attempts to do that by regulation. And what the REINS Act would simply do is say, stop, Mr. President, stop, Cabinet Secretary. You have to have the advice and the consent of the representatives of the American people before you're going to move for something that's going to hit us that hard. We have 197 co-sponsors on the bill so far. It's held 2 hearings in the Judiciary Committee, was passed out of the Judiciary Committee 2 weeks ago. Had a markup in the Rules Committee to go over some technical pieces inside of the bill with the timelines on vote triggers. It's passed out of the Rules Committee, and we're looking for a vote here, hopefully in the very near future, to see it passed and sent over to the United States Senate. But I appreciate what you are doing to champion this move to not only awaken the American people to the huge economic impact of overregulation, but presenting a wide variety of legislative fixes that you and many of our colleagues have authored to stem this tide of reach of the government and to allow our economy to stand up in energy, in manufacturing, and agriculture. And with that, I thank you and yield back.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Davis, for reclaiming my time, and I thank you for the work you've done on the REINS Act. It's good. This is a good bill. This needs to be passed by the Congress.